Paul is the National Director of Community Rights US. I'll let him get more into his specific stuff. On your table you have a handout which gives you a complete description of Paul and his organization. They do, as I have learned this evening, some of you have already seen him this last week or so.
Right.
So he does presentations and workshops, and OWR is going to be speaking to him about doing a real full-blown workshop. This is obviously only an hour kind of presentation, so it's not going to be a full-blown workshop. Over on that table are some of his books and stuff that are available, and he'll probably tell you a little bit more about that. The important thing is you get to know each other, you understand how much you really have in common. One of the things I was very impressed with talking to Paul is that he's been all over the rural Wisconsin and probably not spent as much time in Madison, but that made us very happy because we kind of know all the folks in Madison, and we're trying to get around a little bit more and see other people's problems. Why I'm personally thrilled is that Paul helps people pass laws to get some more or regain the control we once had over our communities, and he's going to be talking about that. I think a few years ago, we voted in a group of folks that told us that they were going to honor our community rights and that we were all going to be fine and good, and almost immediately started taking away those rights. Yeah. I think Harry is practically a living encyclopedia of what's kind of gone wrong out in the rural areas. And I've spent a good amount of time out there as well. I think more than we see it in Madison out there, more directly they see the effects of people taking away their community's control of their community's resources. So I think what Paul has to say is incredibly important. And now I will do you all a favor and shut up. Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Al. I really have to start by just telling you all how amused I am that I'm here as your speaker tonight. I rarely turn down an invitation to speak. I love public speaking, but up until about 1 p.m. yesterday or 2 p.m. yesterday, my plan was to be here and eat pizza and do a 3-minute presentation about community rights. And if I hadn't been sitting in Mother Fool's Coffee House at 1 p.m. about to close my computer and drive to Sparta, where I did some organizing support work last night, I wouldn't even be here probably. I wouldn't have even found out that I was being asked to do it. Be your last minute appraisement speaker. So I'm appreciating the invitation. But as you can imagine, I do not have as much. I do a lot of off-the-cuff speaking, and normally I would do a more organized talk, but I haven't had any time to do that. So you're going to hear an off-the-cuff talk, which is what's more fun for me anyway. As Al said, I am the founding director of Community Rights US, which is a new national organization based in Portland, Oregon, which is officially where I live, but I'm currently living in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin with my sweetheart, who is happily giving me housing support so that I can be traveling all over this region leading workshops on community rights. And I've been coming here for the past 6 or 7 years mostly to the Driftless area of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to lead community rights workshops. I'm actually going to just read off really quickly the counties in Wisconsin where I have led workshops and where I've attempted to help folks get started with this work. Starting with Dane, Sauk, Vernon, Crawford, Monroe, La Crosse, these are all counties. Jackson, Trempealeau, Eau Claire, Chippewa, Dunn, Washburn, Ashland, Marinette, and Outagamie. Is that how you say it? Outagamie. So that's a lot of places. And so there's been an attempt in every one of those Wisconsin counties. This is a map of all the places. Feel free to look at it afterwards. That I've been trying to help start community rights local organizations. The community rights movement is is a pretty bold and edgy social movement. It recognizes that virtually all of the single issue activism that we're doing today is not being very effective. And we know this because if it was being very effective, the trajectory of the ecological crisis would actually be getting better, not worse. The trajectory of the labor crisis would be getting better, not worse. The trajectory of general economic justice or environmental sustainability, those trajectories would be on a curve towards more and more justice and sustainability. So about 15 or 20 years ago, a group of people called the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy started meeting. Richard Grossman and Jane Ann Morris were among the principals. Jane Ann is a Madison local. And they started to try to figure out how can it be that we've got so many thousands of single-issue groups doing really important work, but it doesn't seem to add up. And what they ended up coming to the conclusion about was that there's something structurally wrong with our activism, that we could be doubling the amount of what we're doing, but there's something structurally wrong. So it wouldn't matter. In other words, we could have prettier parade floats, marching past the New York Times to try to get their attention to put us on the front page in a major rally, or we could, double the number of signatures on our online petitions, or we could pack the public hearings of the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture or DNR or whatever, but it still wouldn't add up because there's something structurally wrong with our activism. That's what we came to believe in the early 1990s at the beginning of the community rights movement. And so what has ended up transpiring out of that, it took about 8 or 10 years, but ultimately the movement transformed itself from just doing trainings around the country called Rethinking the Corporation, Rethinking Democracy, into what we now call the community rights movement, which is about helping grassroots organizations and ad hoc groups in local communities to reimagine the way that they're doing their single issue organizing and educating, so that they start to comprehend and shift strategies, recognizing that virtually all of the activism that we do today in the United States is merely a symptom of corporate rule, right? That we have the healthcare crisis we have because we, the people, are allowing healthcare, I shouldn't even call them healthcare corporations, health management corporations, to make policy decisions about healthcare in the United States. And we have the energy crisis that we have today in the United States because we, the people, are allowing energy corporation executives to be making energy policy, which is how we end up with nuclear power instead of a sustainable energy system. And coal and oil still holding on for its last grasps. And we end up with the agricultural systems we have today with monocrop agriculture and GMOs, et cetera, because we, the people, allow corporate agricultural directors to make policy about what kind of foods are going to be grown and are going to be available and how it's going to be processed. And we, the people, allow corporate directors to make all sorts of decisions about how work is going to be organized, so that, you go, if you have a factory job, frequently you're just kind of an extension of the machine that you're operating because you didn't have any real control, any decision-making control over how work is organized and how the corporate profits are going to be used, and invested, et cetera. Are they going to be plowed back in the community or go to the CEO, for example? So when you look at issue after issue after issue, right, now we're about to enter into a conflict, God forbid, in Iran, right? And I think everyone in the room knows that if there was no profit to be made in a foreign invasion, there wouldn't be a foreign invasion, right? That once again, we have the military-industrial complex, right, which is making policy decisions constantly to put us in these situations. So in our movement, we're thinking, if all of these single issues are actually ultimately symptoms of corporate rule, symptoms of allowing corporate directors to make decisions for the public, to make policy, then how are we going to get our authority back? Because we the people. We are the sovereign people. And constitutionally, there's no body more powerful than we the people. And I think some of us might remember that from civics class, except almost nobody gets civics class anymore. But in civics class, we once learned that we the people are the sovereign, which means we have authority to rule, right? We have authority to govern. And the American Revolution, you will find if you actually dig deeper than the conventional history books, is that to a large degree the American Revolution was about claiming the right of local self-government, right? That people wanted the yoke of that oppression of the British monarchy thrown off their backs, and they wanted to be free and have self-governing authority locally. So after the American Revolution, every single state constitution had a clause about the right of community self-government, right? And those are all gone, right? There were political coups against every one of those early state revolutions. And we've ended up with much more conventional state constitutions. So the movement has ended up growing very rapidly around the country as we start to imagine how do we actually act not as single issue activists, but as a sovereign people. At the local level, what would we have to do to reimagine our citizenship participation? So we're not just single issue activists, and we're not just consumers who vote with our dollars, which is actually a meme that the corporate leaders want us to believe, right? The whole concept of being a consumer is actually a corporate meme. I don't know if people realize that, right? We now have consumer rights movements, Ralph Nader, thank you, and others. But originally, the whole concept of consumer was a corporate concept. It wasn't one of ours. And so what does it look like for us to enshrine our authority as the sovereign people and take our authority back over decision making? And the way that we're doing that in the community rights movement is we're helping local communities to pass really extraordinary laws, which we call community rights laws. And they're like nothing that you've ever seen before. And more than 200 communities and counties in 12 states have now passed community rights laws. And I've been working my butt off in Iowa and Wisconsin and Minnesota for something like 30 trips now since 2013, and other places as well, but this is the area that keeps drawing me back with more and more requests to help local communities to stop corporations from harming them and to enshrine into their local lawmaking the right of community self-government and the right to not be harmed by business corporations. And so these 200 communities and counties in 12 states that have passed our local laws, our community rights ordinances, since 1999, have passed bans on fracking in a couple of dozen communities, have passed bans on water bottling, sucking up water to put in little bottles, plastic bottles, in a handful of communities in Maine. Something like 20 communities, 20 townships in rural Pennsylvania, overwhelmingly conservative rural communities, have banned factory farms. There's a handful of communities in New Hampshire that have banned what they call unsustainable energy development and transportation. And they've defined what unsustainable energy is. And anything that meets their definition of unsustainable energy, they no longer allow to take place in their town or in their county. There's a community in Maine that has banned unsustainable infrastructure. And they define unsustainable infrastructure as anything that is not locally and democratically controlled. So a pipeline that's running, that was proposed through Sangerville, Maine, the community that first did this, they banned unsustainable infrastructure, including pipelines, and a NAFTA superhighway that was proposed to run through Sangerville, Maine, called the East-West Corridor. Anybody heard of that? It was part of the original NAFTA treaty. That Maine would get an east-west highway that was not open to the public. It was just for corporate freight, and it would run from Quebec through Maine to a coastal port, I think back in Canada, I believe. So these are the sorts of things that I work on. I helped a community, the first county in California passed a community rights law 3 or 4 years ago. It banned fracking in Mendocino County, California. The first community on the Oregon coast I helped pass a ban on aerial spraying of pesticides on forest and farmland, countywide in Lincoln County, Oregon, a handful of years ago. So that's just like the briefest of overviews of what our movement is doing. And that's really, and each of these ordinances does three really extraordinary things. They ban a particular harmful corporate activity, which is currently legalized and normalized through the regulatory process. In other words, these are normally regulated activities that a state regulatory agency provides a permit so that the company can legally harm you. Right? The permit is a way of the government legalizing a corporation to harm us. It permits a corporation to harm us in a legal, normal way that we're supposed to just get used to, like fracking chemicals, like clear-cut logging, etc. The second thing is it strips from that sector of corporations the access to constitutional rights. The corporations claim all sorts of constitutional rights starting in 1819. We're in the 200th anniversary this year, 2019, of the US Supreme Court granting rights to corporations through the Constitution, beginning with a case in 1819 that had to do with Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And it bans within the municipal or county boundary a corporation accessing any of its so-called constitutional rights. So that's free speech rights, which means they can no longer donate to the political process because the courts have ruled that you can't stop a corporation from influencing an election with their money because that would violate a corporation's right to speak. That's what the court said in 1976 in a pretty extraordinary decision. And so since 1976, Buckley v. Vallejo, corporations can now give unlimited amounts of money to influence elections, and we know what's happened with Citizens United more recently. Each of these are just endless expansions of corporate rights. Corporations have property rights, they have access to the courts, they have privacy rights, they have search and seizure protections, etc., etc. Each one of these I could talk about for an hour. I'm just like giving you this very brief skim of the surface. So that's the first two that each one of our local laws does. Bans a particular corporate activity and strips that sector of corporations of all their constitutional rights within the city or county. And the third thing is enshrines the right of that community to govern itself and protect its health and welfare, regardless of whether the state says you can or cannot, because every state in the country is now jumping on this state preemption bandwagon, and progressives tend to think it's conservatives only in states that are doing this, but it's not. I live in Oregon, where our overwhelmingly Democrat-controlled state legislature, state government, we have a supermajority in our two houses of the legislature, Democrats, for the first time in a long time in the last election. We have a Democrat governor and a Democrat attorney general, and yet that body banned counties from banning GMO agriculture a handful of years ago when Monsanto pressured them to do that. And that overwhelmingly Democrat state government has, a number of years ago, banned cities from putting tenants' rights laws into place, right? Preemption. So states across the political spectrum are banning local communities from protecting their health and welfare, their own health and welfare. And so our ordinances also push back on that. And we say, you can't, if a state legislature passes a law that preempts a local community merely from protecting its health and welfare, that state legislature's act is a violation of our rights as we the people. It's illegitimate. It does not meet the requirement of consent of the governed, which is written into every state constitution in some words or another. Those exact words are in the Wisconsin state constitution, in the very first paragraph of your constitution, that consent to the government is required in the state for legitimate governing to take place. So all three of these things are in each one of our, am I just going in and out with this thing? Did it just stop?
It just stopped.
Okay.
Push the mute button a little bit.
Push the mute button. Oh, it's red. Does that mean it turned off?
Yeah, your battery
Red
is.
means
Okay. And then
Yeah.
how do I, is there an on-off?
Mute button.
Okay. Hello? No?
No.
Maybe mute is on?
No, it's on.
It's on.
Okay?
Yeah.
Is that, okay.
Batteries are out.
All right, so, so that's just an incredibly short rundown of the stuff that we're doing. And it's really interesting because, like, I'm a big Bernie guy. I'm incredibly excited about Bernie's campaign. And I'm not active with the Bernie campaign in Oregon, but I'm very active in pushing him around all the conversations I have, pushing my buddies in Oregon around those conversations. And one of the things that makes me incredibly excited about Bernie Sanders' campaign is that he's one of the only truly progressive candidates, national political figures in the United States who can actually speak to conservatives. It's just so interesting. Like, he crosses over really beautifully. Something like 10 or 15% of the people who voted for Trump in the general election voted for Bernie in the primary. And that's a lot of people. That's millions and millions of people, right? Who clearly were not the people who were the ideological racists, right? Who voted for Trump. And so when I look at a candidate like that, and everyone's always saying, oh, he's a socialist, he can never win Republican votes, I actually think the opposite. I think he's, when he went on Fox for the town hall meeting a month or two ago, I bet you a bunch of people here saw that. It was really extraordinary. The reporters were expecting one gotcha moment after another for him, and the audience just ate him up. How many people saw that? Yeah? I mean, it's really worth watching. You can find it on YouTube. It's a full-hour town hall meeting that was broadcast live on Fox with candidate Bernie Sanders. And he got in a lot of shit for just even being willing to go on Fox for that town hall meeting. It's really a must-watch. And it just, again, it proves the point that Fox can fill a studio with people who are their viewers and overwhelming excitement for what Bernie Sanders offered them in that room that night. So a message, and his kind of economic populist message really resonates with scared people across the political spectrum, and I'm very excited about that. Our movement is not a progressive movement, interestingly enough. It's very non-ideological. Of the 200 communities in 12 states that have passed these ordinances, the vast majority are rural conservative communities, which really puts the lie to, who conservatives are, right? And these are not Tea Party conservatives, who are a much more kind of rash and angry and scary bunch, in my direct experience. They're old-fashioned conservatives who exist all over rural America and are really scared about the future of this country. And if you frame issues for conservatives in a different way, not I'm an environmentalist, but I'm trying to figure out how we can protect our local water and our local air and our local food supply so that they're not poisoned or taken over by corporate rule, you have a conversation across the political spectrum immediately. It's really, to a large degree, about framing. So in our work, we work equally well in rural conservative communities and in urban, more liberal communities. And we can talk about and help communities write ordinances about economic justice and ecological sustainability and even the climate emergency if we're talking about it in terms of local control and health and welfare, health, safety, and welfare of local communities, amazingly enough. So, just to give you an example, I was in Sparta last night working with a group of people who were, my understanding, I just met them in person for the first time, many of them last night, but most of them were not associated really politically with any particular party. They were very diverse, and about 15 of them and I went to the Monroe County Planning and Zoning Committee meeting last night in Sparta. This is a group of people who are insisting that the Monroe County Board pass a community rights ordinance that bans any more frac sand mines. Well, what the Planning and Zoning Committee wants to do is pass an ordinance that regulates frac sand mines. Because once again, that's what we the people have been told that our local activism can look like. We've been told that you can regulate corporate activities and you can zone corporate activities, but you cannot prohibit corporate activities at the local level. That is a structure of law that's in place. that in this country that's been there for a long time, that our own attorneys will say, oh, that's settled law, there's nothing you can do about it. And yet, a lot of these laws that are so-called settled laws were written by people who've been dead for a century. And here we are in a democratic republic, and we can't have a conversation about changing those laws? I mean, it's really extraordinary, right? And so here's a community that's saying, we're starting to understand that you can't stop any further frac sand mines in Monroe County if you regulate frac sand mines, because to regulate them is to set rules about what hours of the day a truck can roll through a neighborhood, and how high a sand pile can be, and how far they have to be from water, from moving or standing water, to not contaminate the water, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now you have another frac sand mine, right? And so communities are kind of led by the nose into these regulatory processes, and increasingly they're discovering that is a corporate playing field. That's a corporate framework, that when we cooperate with these regulatory and zoning processes, we get the thing that we didn't want to have. And so in our movement, we step out of these systems of law, like regulatory and zoning law, because you can't stop harmful corporate activities locally through regulations or zoning. So, where do I want to go with this? I wanted to speak for only about 30-ish minutes. When did I start? 7, so I'm right about there. So I'm just going to speak for a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to conversation. And so just to tell you a bit about what I was doing one night before, I was in Harry's community, or at least close to Harry's community. I was in Monroe, in southern Wisconsin, meeting with the local chapter of the Wisconsin Farmers Union that was celebrating its 5th anniversary as a local chapter, and is building power at the local level. And with every local group that I help to support, the question is, what are the concerns that have something to do with corporate power in this community? And what would you like to do in terms of passing a local law that stretches way beyond what we think we're allowed to do? So for example, in Madison, I regularly hear from progressives in Madison that the city's in pretty good shape and there really aren't any overarching significant issues. And I hear that a lot in more urban, liberal, more privileged communities. Well, I don't really believe that at all. My perspective is that corporations are ruling us everywhere, and we just don't see it. It's what I call hidden in plain sight. And now corporations are operating in a very powerful way, in ways that we just don't notice anymore. So for example, I think it would be incredibly exciting if this group or another group in the city who wants to reach across the ideological spectrum and do some organizing that would reach out to all working class people, you could organize and campaign for a community rights ordinance that restores your higher minimum wage in the city of Madison. You lost your higher minimum wage when the state preempted it. I'm not sure exactly how long ago that was. I assume it was a couple of years ago. Does anybody remember?
Yeah, it was after 2011.
After 2011?
Yes.
So that
But I gotta tell you what happened.
was Scott's first term, I guess, right?
Yes, it was.
So we've been told as activists in our communities that you can't do that. You can't pass a law that restores that higher minimum wage that Madison residents, I understand, were already getting. Is that correct? Before it was taken away by the state? I mean, that's an incredible insult to working people, to have won a higher minimum wage and to make assumptions about that money that you're now making for your kids' college or for a medical emergency or to move into a larger home or whatever, and then it's gone. I mean, that's really an obscene thing to do to the residents of a community. And so, this is one example of something that a progressive city or Dane County could do, is you could work to pass. You'd have to get your city council or your county government to pass it, because Wisconsin doesn't have local ballot initiatives like a lot of states do. Like in Oregon, we can actually make law directly through the ballot box at the city and county level, but Wisconsin and many states cannot, which, by the way, I mean, that's an outrage as well. And it's always amazing to me that in the 20-some states that don't allow the citizens to collect signatures and put something on the ballot at the local or county state level and make law and bypass your elected officials, as 20-some states can do, it's amazing to me that that organizing is not being done in states with this level of activism like Wisconsin, right? That would clear out so much crap that you folks need to change. If the public, which tends to be ahead of its politicians, could give itself the authority to pass local laws, like 20-some states do. So that's just one idea. You could also imagine the community taking on the climate emergency. You could start banning banks that do business in your city from making any loans to fossil fuel corporations, right? Or investing in it. You could make a decision. You could pass a law that said that says the Madison Airport is not allowed to expand beyond its existing flights, and it needs to start cutting back, right? You could make a law in this city that starts to take on the reality that there's only enough bus service that people who own cars don't really think that they have to take the bus, right? Because the service isn't good enough for most people who cars are their default means of transportation, right? Or you could pass a community rights law in the city that says that starting in 2 years, every supermarket of at least a certain amount of food shelf storage, food shelving, starting next in a year or two and increasing by, let's say, 10% a year, has to sell food that is either grown or processed within 500 miles of Madison, right? If we start to look at the climate emergency through a different lens, not, how are we going to convince our state and federal elected officials to do something serious about the climate emergency, but what is it that we're prepared to do to change the way we're living in our community? And if we start to see ourselves as the people of this place who have authority to govern ourselves, regardless of whether the structures of law tell us we do or not, then the sky's the limit, right? And so in our movement, we talk a lot about how colonized our minds are. That even, profoundly impressive radical activists across the country, I would argue, have very colonized minds because it's really hard for them to step outside of those structures of law and imagine doing things which are not currently legal, right? It's like, so we have these movements that are in the streets blockading and marching and doing civil disobedience, but they don't imagine themselves taking it one step further and imagining their local lawmaking as an act of municipal civil disobedience, right? If we can't change background normal in the very near future in every community in the United States, we're not going to survive as a species, right? The UN says 12 years, and some scientists say way less than that. Whether it's 3 years or 50 years, right? We know people, or we're alive today, who are going to be seeing the end, right? And so is the best that we can do pleading with our state and federal government officials to do something, not sure what, or what would it look like if we, the people, imagine ourselves as the deciders, the ultimate deciders, which, believe it or not, constitutionally, we are that body, except we don't believe that we are, and we don't know how to operate in that way, and so we don't, right? It's a mind-made colonization, right? And what if we do our own decolonizing work as privileged white people and start imagining what it would look like if we started changing the laws ourselves because we have to, because we're in an emergency moment on the planet. And we could do this around protecting the lives of black and brown-skinned people. We have community rights ordinances for that. We could be doing it around giving a Bill of Rights to working people at the local level. We've written an ordinance for that. I'm currently drafting a housing Bill of Rights ordinance that would actually give new protection for both homeless people and renters who are being gentrified out of their homes, out of their rentals. right? We don't think about this stuff because we're so convinced that we're not allowed to, that we just don't. It's a self-imposed kind of lock on our brains. So I'm just gonna close. I think I've been talking plenty long already. I hope this has been interesting and provocative. And I would love to come back and talk to you more. I would love to do my 3-hour introductory community rights workshop for our Wisconsin Revolution. I would love to speak to a much larger crowd if you wanted to organize hundreds of people for me to talk to. I have key books about community rights on the table. I have a handout. If somebody, Harry, would you be willing to just grab this and make sure everybody gets one? Yeah, sure. I've got a little flyer to just give you some basic info about Community Rights US, the organization that I founded with others a year and a half ago that helps communities around the United States to launch these campaigns, to step outside of these systems of law that do not serve us, where we cannot protect our health and welfare properly, and create new systems of law where we can do that properly. So I'm interested in what you all have to say. Let's have a conversation. Thank you very much.
So I'm Steve. I am just wondering about the minimum wage. Madison already passed it in the past. Is it still on the books? Just because the state says we can't have a minimum wage law. And what is? I want you to take me through like the what happens next. I imagine. This goes to the courts. The courts are saying, no, you can't. They're doing an injunction saying, no, you can't enforce this law because it's against the state law. What's
right?
Follow.
Yeah, no, those are critical questions. Thank you. So, of the 200 communities and 12 communities and counties in 12 states that have passed our laws, 95% have never been legally challenged, which is pretty darn fascinating because our laws violate state preemption. They violate that preemption, and they violate these claimed rights that corporations have through the U.S. Supreme Court. So that means that about 190 of 200 of these communities banned a particular corporate activity that was being proposed, and they weren't sued, which is really an extraordinary record. So what if you are sued? So the handful of communities, of that 10 or so that were sued, the vast majority of them were in the early days where the city or town or county council had not had what we think of kind of as this culture shift education that's really important, so that as soon as you get sued, you don't just crumple and hide and run away. That the whole point is to push these structures of law, right? To say these are not meeting our needs and we're not, and there isn't consent anymore. So something like 7 of the 10 literally just, as soon as there was a threat of a lawsuit, they took it off their books and the lawsuit went away. What's much more interesting is what's happening in the other few. And one of those most interesting stories is Grant Township, Pennsylvania, where 3 or 4 years ago, this tiny little township, I don't know what it is about the DNA of rural conservative Pennsylvanians, but these folks are tough. There's a company that I believe is called Pennsylvania General Energy Company, and they drilled a deep hole in the ground in Grant Township with the plan to pour hundreds of thousands of gallons of highly toxic frack wastewater into that hole. And that hole is less than a half a mile from Grant Township's sole water supply. And the township said no. And they passed an ordinance and saying you can't do it here. They weren't fracking there, they just wanted to dump their frack wastewater in Grant Township. And the corporation sued the town and said, you're not home rule, you don't have the authority to do that. And so the town went, okay. So they withdrew their ordinance and they immediately passed a home rule charter, and then they amended their charter to add the ordinance back in. So the first lawsuit's now gone because they're now home rule. And then the corporation sued again, and our lawyers have fought them in the courts and are countersuing, saying, regardless of what the judicial system says, we're not going to let you poison our water supply. So you've got all of the elected officials in Grant Township, unanimous, and the overwhelming majority of this very tiny population in Grant Township that have basically gotten to the point, as have the other 200 communities, where they're now less afraid of a lawsuit from the state or from a corporation than they are of losing their fresh water or their quality of life or their clean air or their uncontaminated land or whatever. That the lawsuit is no longer the thing that stops them from acting. And so if you understand our constitutional authority as the sovereign people, all the various parts of government, from local to federal, are required to serve we the people. They have duties and responsibilities to we the people. If they're not doing those duties diligently, if they're not fulfilling their responsibilities, once again, there isn't consent to the governed. So what the people in Grant Township and in increasing numbers of other rural residents in these communities are saying is, we don't care how many judicial decisions come down saying that our ordinance is a violation of state preemption or corporate rights. We're not backing down. You can sue us. You can put our township supervisors in jail. You can seize our salt shed that protects our tractor in the winter. But we're not going to let you poison our water supply. And what they're doing is they're following in the footsteps of what the early American revolutionaries did, right? Who began with some very treasonous acts, right? And if you look at the history of our social movements in the United States, how does the American Revolution start? It starts with people no longer conceding legitimacy of the Crown's government. In Worcester and in Springfield and other communities in Massachusetts, they withdrew their consent and they started passing their own laws. That's how it starts. And that's the way the abolitionist movement worked and the suffragist movement worked, is you withdraw your consent. It's an act of collective civil disobedience. So that's what's happening now around the country. In fact, there's a community, State College, Pennsylvania, which is where Penn State is. Huge university in a tiny town. Penn State passed a ban on any more pipelines underneath the town some years ago. And when it was clear that the university was going to violate the ban and just act like it didn't exist, they called in Occupy Wall Street and Greenpeace USA, and the town who had voted overwhelmingly for the ban said, teach us civil disobedience because it looks like we're going to have to enforce the ordinance we passed with nonviolent civil disobedience. And they amended their ordinance to say that civil disobedience to defend the ban will be considered enforcement. They gave civil disobedience the category of legal enforcement of the ordinance and refused to take it off the books. So once again, so the courts say you can't. So who are we? Do we crumple? Right? I mean, we're in an ecological emergency right now in the United States. And if the structures of law say that you're not allowed to protect your local community from harm by corporations, we just surrender? Right? What do we do? Right? This is what we're trying to do. And interestingly enough, rural conservatives get this much more than progressive urban people do. Right? They're actually prepared to fight to protect their health and welfare at the local level from corporate harm. Complicated answer to an important question.
I was wondering, do you see any parallels to what you're advocating and similar actions that also took place in ostensibly conservative rural areas? I was thinking of the populists in the Dakotas, or what happened during the Depression in Iowa or Wisconsin, where farmers engaged in milk dumping and obstructing of forced sheriff sales.
Yeah, I think the populist movement of the 1880s and 90s is an absolutely essential piece of this history. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, can I, before you start, I just want to pass around, if anyone's interested in just getting more information about us, I'll just pass this around. Feel free to give me your contact info, and I will send anybody who gives us your name and email address. I'll throw a pen around with it. Well, I'll send you more information about the community rights movement. Yeah.
On the topic of Trump's illegitimacy,
Yes.
I ran into journalist author Greg Pallas the day before he spoke here at Fighting Bob Festival in 2016,
Okay.
and thus felt obligated to buy his book and watch the film version of The
Yeah.
Best Democracy Money Can Buy, A Tale of Billionaires and Ballot Bandits, which was a sequel to a similar book he did in 2000.
Yeah.
Now, Ari Berman of The Nation calls vote suppression the least talked about news story of 2016. And Pallas goes in, along with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a voting rights attorney and the son of the late. They estimate 6 million stolen votes, including over 1 million by so-called interstate cross-check.
Right.
There were 7.2 million names on the cross-check list. Pallas estimates 1 out of 7, over 1 million, got actually purged, likely without the voters' knowledge.
Right.
The American Civil Liberties Union has numerous lawsuits pertaining to cross-check, but there's nothing remotely like a class action lawsuit that 100 million Americans could sign on board with to demand a revote. And one reason for the relative silence of the Democrats, although they skirt around the issue, they seem to have been guilty of vote suppression in the primaries. Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 11/9, Bernie won all 55 counties in West Virginia by a landslide,
Right.
yet Hillary
And he
won
lost
8
the-
superdelegates
Yes.
and was awarded the state.
I'm with you 100%. Yeah.
So how do, the courts do not grant standing to citizens? Voting is not a right of ours? That seems to be what I feel has taken place. Now, maybe I'm wrong about,
No, I think you're spot on. I mean, I followed this issue also very carefully. I don't remember the data the way you did. That was great. I can't quote any of those specific numbers accurately, but I'm following the topic, with a brain that doesn't hold specifics. While we're waiting for state governments to act, I mean, states are just continuing to buy machines that are not safe for their voting public. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? So once again, what would a sovereign people do if we actually were committed to stopping voting machines that can't accurately count votes, right? Or cross-check, which is like a private corporation, I think, right? That like steals millions of people's votes away. What would we do? Right? I've never actually heard that conversation in a public space, right? And how would we start? What would the city of Madison do? What law would it pass if we weren't worried about whether it was legal or state preempted or not, to say in Madison, this will be the bottom line for all voting, right? Every machine will be required to X, Y, Z. Or, hey, let's do something really radical and do the Canadian system, which is paper ballots, counted by human beings.
Madison already does that. And people that criticize, I'm an election official in Madison, people who criticize Madison City Clerk for the voting in this town need to become election officials.
I'm talking about structural change, though. I'm talking beyond that. If you don't...
The tally machines are not hooked up to the internet. They cannot be interfered with.
Okay.
Ever. They are never.
Do you have any voter suppression in your city? If you don't, then in this issue...
we do.
Okay.
Something that we could specifically do would be we could grant voter rights to felons.
You sure could.
People
do.
in prison.
When well, when
In
you're
prison.
off paper,
No, but this is what
when
Bernie's
you're off paper,
recommending right now.
Wisconsin, you get your voting rights back,
Yes.
which is a rarity in this country.
Okay, but in Europe,
in
you don't lose your voting rights when you're in prison, right? So in most of the world, most of the democratic world.
Well, then don't we have to take over control of the State House?
No, I'm talking about local ordinances.
No.
Well,
That's where you start. See, I have never understood why progressives are so attached to it having to be at the state or federal level initially. If you look at how social change works in our history, it always starts in a particular local place, and it scales up. If you look at the beginning of the abolitionist movement, does anyone know the absolute beginning? Like, it's 6 college students in a Quaker college, I think in Pennsylvania, I don't even remember anymore, who tried to get their Quaker church to pass an abolitionist resolution. And it took like 40 years for that to happen. And then it slowly spread from a place to a bunch of colleges to a bunch of communities, and then it becomes a state movement, and then it becomes a federal movement. You look at the beginning of the American Revolution. It literally starts in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I believe Springfield, Massachusetts. And if you read a book called The Spirit of 74 by Ray Raphael, who's like now become the people's historian of the American Revolution in the US, you will find out the actual start of the revolution. It starts in local places, right? And historically then through word of mouth, it spreads and more communities take risks, right? Do people know that there were 90 declarations of independence written by local villages across the United States before there ever was a Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson? He took 90 declarations of independence. These were treasonous documents, every one of them. Right? These are illegal acts, these declarations of independence. Right? Why are we always starting at the state level? Right? Even when we have supposedly progressive people in majority, they're frequently fairly spineless progressives, in my experience. Right? We need some bold leadership. So if we're in a climate emergency and our local elected officials are not passing the laws that are necessary to respond to the crisis at the scale that it is, we've got the wrong people in local office, right? And they need to be knocked out in the next election and bold people put in. We are not acting as a sovereign people. That's my primary point tonight.
So now I understand why your name is Cienfuegos.
It's a taken name, by the way.
With regards to the CAFLs here in Wisconsin, and I was living in Texas at the time that I think the legislation was signed in 2006. Basically what you're talking about, Paul, but it was signed in by Doyle, Democrat Governor Doyle, I believe in 2006.
The preemption that happened in Texas around...
Well, no, I'm talking about Wisconsin. I was living there.
It was actually written in 2004 and went into effect
in 2006.
By Democrats.
But it was signed by a Democratic governor, is my point.
It's appalling.
And so the thing, well, and what you're talking about, Paul, with regards to how'd you word it, legal, this permit to allow legal harm.
Yeah, regulatory permits.
Well, another one
Yeah.
that is really in the books that's just in front of everybody right now, NAFTA.
Absolutely, yeah.
NAFTA was done for the corporations.
By
It
Bill
knocked
Clinton.
out all the little companies.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
what surprises me, is what you're saying about this state of mind that we're in.
Yeah.
I remember a few years ago, some anthropologist or sociologist getting in big trouble because he said underdevelopment was a state of mind, referring to Latin America. Well, okay, what he was saying, but he was absolutely right. Our underdevelopment is a state of mind.
Yeah.
Our underdevelopment in consenting to these things.
Yeah, how can we feel powerless, privileged white people in a rich country? It's extraordinary.
And just finally here is, I'm from Crawford County, Kickapoochee. And so if anybody wants to challenge that later, okay?
You should know that the Crawford Stewardship Project is working on a community rights ordinance. Yeah,
Okay.
which they're hoping to pass in one of their townships.
Well, they're getting prepared. The Roth pig CAFL is getting prepared for another big CAFL. And now, I can't believe what they're talking about, the number of pig sows in
It's
this situation.
tens of thousands, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
downhill all the way to the Kickapoo River.
Oh, God.
yeah. And it's entirely legal. It's regulated by the Pennsylvania, or whatever, in this case, the Wisconsin
Well,
Department of Agriculture.
Finally,
We have a factory farm ban ordinance. It's ready to go. It needs to be passed somewhere.
a large
It's been
farmer,
drafted.
a large farmer out there that I know very well, who has been always from the area, just said to me a week or two ago, says, Kevin, we can't do it by ourselves out here. We can do it, but he didn't say it that way. He said the urban people have to step up because that's where the populations are. But did we talked about it?
If it's a state organizing, but not if it's local.
The urban people, there's too much of this urban elitism. And I understand these rural conservatives.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm regularly in conversation with rural conservatives around this region, and they're very approachable on this issue.
We're getting on to 8 o'clock. I'm going to
Okay.
exercise my own personal privilege to ask a question. If you do pass the ordinance and you do get sued, while you're being sued, are you able to enforce the ordinance?
It's up to the citizens whether they are going to enforce the ordinance.
Okay. But they can't, right?
Well, they can if they think they can.
Okay.
It's a mind-made problem, frankly, Al. Right? When a county passes a law, the sheriff is required to enforce that law. The county DA is required to enforce that law. The county council is required to enforce that law. If the state sues, they're going to have to deal with the county's enforcement mechanisms enforcing that law. Right? We're trying to create jurisdictional crises. Right? And that's how social change happens, by the way. Look at the marijuana legalization movement in the United States. California passes the first statewide legalization of marijuana, Prop 215, decades ago by now. That's an illegal ordinance. Illegal law. Every single one of the states that have legalized either medical or recreational marijuana in this country to date is illegal. Did you know that? Under federal law, it's illegal. Why don't we care? Well, because citizens mobilized better than the federal government, and we won. Right? We won the argument. The feds still say it's illegal, but now they're up against state attorney generals, state legislatures, county sheriffs, governors, right? They lost. That's all we're talking about doing at the local level, is building a consciousness-raising movement of local people doing exactly the same thing, pushing back on the state's claim that we're not allowed to protect our health and welfare.
Thank you, Paul.
What did you do with the fracking water from Pennsylvania? Where did it end up?
They dump it in holes in the ground that they've drilled. That's where it goes. They drill deep holes and it goes away. And it poisons the groundwater for long distances, and it causes streams to become flammable.
I think she's asking did they stop them from doing it?
Oh, that company hasn't dumped it in that hole. I have no idea
Right, but
what
my
they've done.
question is, so they have this water, where
Yeah.
do they end up dumping it?
They probably have many
Someone
holes.
allows them permission.
They probably have lots of holes that they own in other townships. It's a good question. I have no idea. But I can tell you they're not going to pour it in that hole in Grand Township, Pennsylvania. Yeah, and the public is going to physically make sure it doesn't happen, whether their law is overruled or not.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, let me just make a quick connection with the rural and urban area. Madison could prohibit the sale of something that was produced by some of these CAFOs. You know who they're producing for, if it's Tyson or well, whoever it is. We could pass a law that prohibits the sale of that in Madison.
Absolutely.
You would get in trouble. It's not
Absolutely.
permitted, but that would be a great urban-rural connection.
Yeah. You could ban anything from being sold in Madison that was produced in a sweatshop overseas. I mean, you're told you can't, but you can. Right?
I'm going to butt in because that was a great comment, and that leads to something I think we need to be saying before we leave here. Part of what we want to do is work together on things.
Yes.
When the folks on the farms are getting, pardon me, screwed, it's important for us to fight back with our dollars here in the city. You can go to the farmer's market. You can go to farms and buy milk. You can do a lot of things to undermine the system. And hopefully, taking Paul's cue, we can get folks in Madison to rally around the idea of passing some laws to actually stop the sale of some of this stuff. But if you're really behind the causes, you need to step up, You need to put your money where your mouth is. You need to put your body where your mouth is. I've been to town hall meetings. Nobody knew I was from Madison. I was just a guy in the audience who stood up and got whoopee for the guy from the local community who was talking. So you can show up, and you can hold your dollars back from companies that are basically abusing our folks here in Wisconsin. All of our folks in Wisconsin. Thank you, Paul, very much.
You bet. Thank you all.
And you can now talk to
Did the sheet go around? I hope it didn't get stuck. Did the sheet get around the tables? Great. Yeah, if you want to get more info about community rights, and if you're interested, let me just tell you real quick what's here, in case you're interested. This is stories from local communities doing this work in mostly rural communities. This is our strategy document if you want to kind of understand our long-term strategy. This book by your local Jane Ann Morris here in Madison, who's one of the gems of the whole movement, is about how corporations came to take the control of the U.S. Constitution. And this is the actual legal brief from our movement's attorneys defending Grant Township, Pennsylvania. If you want to read what a community rights legal brief reads like, and you'll understand every word. This is not legalese. It's designed for lay people to understand this stuff. So, and other stuff too, for sale. And there's some free leaflets as well. Sorry.
Let's wrap up and you can talk to Paul privately. I wanted to let you all know that our assembly in 4 weeks from tonight will have Mike McCabe here to talk about preparing for the 2020 election. So if you aren't already on our mailing list, get on it and you'll get the announcement about his visit. And then in subsequent month, either July or August, we will get Chris Marin in here, and she's promised to be here.
It'll be out shortly.
If you didn't put anything in the jar, we appreciate it. You're covering the cost.
Cool. All right. Thank you. Yeah, once again, if I'll just be standing here near the books if you didn't get a chance to give me your email, or if you want to chat about this stuff.
Hey, Paul, I'm
You have the pizza to call it dinner? I did. You want to have a beer somewhere? Yeah. Want to have a beer at Brasserie?
Well, I didn't say anywhere near as much here as I did in the workshop.
Oh, well, really? We're going to be that way. Are you done with your...
Yeah.
Are we done then? Yeah, except for talking. Okay. And take your stuff, I guess I'm cleaning up today.
Hi, I'm Catherine O'Dell with Sierra Sierra Yes. Yes, I'm interested in your name. I know that some of our people in Sierra have been working with concerns